I think one of the things about this entrance to Strangford Lough is that your eye is almost immediately taken out to the Irish Sea beyond. And if I walk just behind my house, I can see across to the Isle of Man, and I can also see Galloway in Scotland. So in other words, the Lough waters come in from this broader horizon, the broader Irish Sea. And that's, I think, is one of the fascinations of this area too, because it's brought people in by sea from the very, very earliest times. For example, I can take you down to the shore here, and we can walk along it, and I can pick up the odd flint brought by the Mesolithic people who were the first colonists in Ireland. I can take you along the loch a little bit further, and I could show you the burial grounds, the tombs that were erected by the Neolithic people, the first farming colonists here too, who the indications are that at least one lot almost certainly came from the Severn estuary. So that's the bigger picture, and this is the gateway into the north of Ireland just here. Can you look round the corner and look out a little bit? You'll see a rock out there, which is actually, it's a dangerous rock. It's slap in the middle of the channel just off Killard Point, St. Patrick's Rock. And that brings in the association with Patrick, who the patron saint, who came from the south of Ireland a little bit, but almost certainly was sucked into the loch, like many another in his day. And I think it's that feature, the fact that you got as far as the entrance to the loch, and then in the older ships, you didn't have much option. You just ended up in the loch. So history from the wider world comes right into the heart of Strangford, and that's why the shores are littered with the relics from right throughout prehistory and history.
Looking across as we're walking down here, you can see the area of Bishop's Mills. That would be a medieval mill site as well. As you drive along some of the roads around here, you're actually driving through a medieval landscape. You have areas like Bishop's Mills and the Embassy as well. We did some work there recently. It's actually a medieval manor that belonged to the Bishops of Down. Probably functioned something like a grange, a monastic grange. You have to remember that this place in the past wouldn't have been as isolated as we maybe perceive it now from the rest of County Down. Before the drainage in the 18th century, Strangford Lough would have extended all the way toward Downpatrick, and accessing an area like Inchabbey wouldn't have posed such a great problem as we might have thought. They could have sailed a lot of the way there. This site probably does have evidence somewhere in the surrounding landscape for a medieval village that functioned at the time the church and the motte were in use, but we know very little about what they would have been up to. There's some generic things seem to go on around the loch. There's fish traps thrown up along the shore, there's shell middens found along the coasts, but there probably would have been a certain amount of their time would have been afforded to the economy of the loch. Probably would have been farming the land here as well, and perhaps paying tithe to their overlords. So we're walking around the perimeter wall of the graveyard here. This wall was probably thrown up at a much later date than the church's foundation. It's quite likely when the Normans arrived here, there might have been an earlier church as well. Early Christian churches in Ireland tended to be affiliated with Irish royal sites. It would hold a lot of 12th and 13th century fabric, but it was in 1621 the church had become ruinous, and by the 1760s it was re-roofed again and used as a Church of Ireland church. But by 1839, the night of the big wind had taken the roof off, and that was the last time it was really intact with the roof in the 1830s. The savages, they would have buried their dead here. There is one Anglo-Norman coffin lid here that would be of 13th century date. These coffin lids turn up all around the loch, so they're obviously transporting them around the place as well. It just emphasises the role of the loch in the people's lives. So here we are going through the gate into the churchyard now. This graveyard hasn't been used in a long number of years now, but you can see some of these beautiful old 18th and 19th century gravestones with the decoration on. But there's a lot of earlier stones as well that have no carvings on them at all. There's probably poor people. The name Savage in the Ards is still a very common name. You would find it around here, you would find it in Portaferry. Savages eventually moved into Portaferry, built the Tower House there. There's a saying around here, I'd rather be an old savage than a new gent, because the savages split into two sects. One of them had moved to Portaferry and erected the Tower House there, and eventually the family in Portaferry changed their name to Nugent. and that was in order to keep the land due to laws that were brought in penal times. We're inside the church now. We're quite sheltered in this exposed wee peninsula that we're run out into the loch, but it's much more sheltered in here. You can see here at the top end of the church there's some below ground vaults. A lot of these would be savages, but they're much later than the medieval savages that would have been here. But really this church is likely to have formed the family burial ground for the savages throughout the medieval period. A lot of the big families in the medieval period have particular churches that are associated with them. The Motts and Bailey sites are quite important. You quite often find they're intervisible with each other, and the one here at Ardkeen would certainly be intervisible with one across the peninsula at Kirkuson. Throughout the medieval period, as I say, this area is a foothold. It's an area that's very easy to bring supplies into. It's very defensive as well. The whole Ards, you can be cut off from everywhere else when you're in the Ards, like, you know, if you want to be. But at the same time, it's very accessible by boat. The loch's the heart of the thing. It is. Just along the north perimeter wall of the graveyard, you can see on the inside there's this big bank. That could actually relate to earlier activity on the site, some sort of enclosure that was around the church before the wall. Walls were erected in the late 18th and early 19th century around graveyards, really with the view toward trying to keep in any disease that might be associated with burials in the graveyard. At that time, you have to remember, the were epidemics. There was cholera, there was famine. People had fears of these things, so the wall was erected around the graveyard, probably to keep scavengers out as well, but to really stop any of these things making their way out into the wider area. Another interesting aspect about the wee peninsula here at Ardkeen is that although of the medieval activity that's very obvious in the site, we have traces of earlier activity as well. There's an oyster midden here in the peninsula. It was exposed through ploughing, and a local girl has lifted flints around it that would be Mesolithic in date, so you've actually got activity here that goes back thousands of years as opposed to hundreds. I suppose it's testament to the loch that people at the time when they first arrived saw it as a great food resource that could be exploited and used in this way.
I'm sitting here on the stump of the round tower, and it's an ideal location to take in the spirituality of Nendrum, because after 1500 years it still retains its aura of a holy place. We're here in the middle of the central enclosure, the Holy of Holies, where all the ritual activities of the monastery went on, but we were located down in the foreshore outside the enclosure, and we discovered sort of the industrial side of the monastery in the form of a corn mill, a very special corn mill. It was one that was worked by the tides, tidal power rather than fresh water. It fitted into the whole story of the place because we had 400 or 500 monks here, we think, and largely vegetarian, and they needed daily bread, but there are no freshwater streams. So ingeniously they turned to tidal power. Now we don't know if they invented it here, and they built this extremely sophisticated tide mill in 619. We can date it precisely because of the oak in it, and at the moment it's the earliest known tide mill in the world. We know the cultural achievements of the early Irish monasteries and the manuscripts and literature and metalwork, but to see it applied to industrial purposes, it was lovely to document that side of things. So having found the tide mill, actually there was two, one on top of each other, we then re-examined all the archaeology of the monastery. Probably the most exciting thing was to examine the organisation of the monastery. Here at Nendrum we have 3 concentric enclosures enclosing a space of about 8 acres, and that is where the life of the monastery went on. We're here in the centre where the church was, where the round tower was, where the burials were, and this is where people came on pilgrimage. It's where the monks did all their praying. But beyond is the middle enclosure, which was holy but slightly less holy, and that's where the monks lived, where they ate, where they had their workshops, their bronze workshops, their scriptorium to produce manuscripts. And then beyond is the large outer enclosure where they had their farm buildings, where they had barns for the corn for the mill, and where their monastic tenants would have come. And probably they had periodic fairs there. And then we have the beautiful setting in Strangford Lough. And this is one of the many corners of Strangford Lough that one can step right into the past because it's changed so little with the odd intrusive building in the horizon, but we can still appreciate why the monks came here. That quality is still there, the stillness, the spirituality, the daily rhythm of the tides. Half the day they would be in the world, half the day they'd be cut off. Absolutely ideal for the monastic life. To me, it sums up some of the essential qualities of Strangford Lough, the eternal tides. I feel so part of my archaeological life is here, and having studied the place intensively, I come back to get renewed archaeologically, walk over the ground, and I have my own ideas, sometimes highly imaginative of what structure might have been there. But looking back from a 21st century point of view, we probably thought life was very hard, but in the 17th and 8th centuries, life on Ireland was pretty good. It was a very innovative period. They were clearing forests for land and new technology. They had a fairly ordered existence. For instance, here the monastery had a large estate. They owned the surrounding 8 town lands, and that was probably a very well ordered landscape. This is a very good area agriculturally. So life probably would have been pretty good. As archaeologists, you always have to be careful not to patronise the past, And in the 10th century, the Irish started to build in stone. The previous wooden buildings would be very sophisticated, very ornamented. But reconstructed here on the corner of the nave, we have one of the great glories in Antrim, and it's an excellent example, one of the few examples we have of pre-12th century sundials. Fragmentary state, but the main good bit of the face of the actual dial is left and divides the time of the day into 8 sections, which marks the canonical hours. And it gives you the essence of the monastery. These monks followed a very, very strict rule, and they had to pray at certain times during the day and fast or whatever. So the ability to tell the time is absolutely essential, and their whole life would have been governed by this sundial. So one monk, the timekeeper, would keep an eye, and when the shadow fell, and he would have rang a bell, and the monks would have come in from other areas of the closure and from the surrounding fields. And it's a beautiful example. There were only about 12 in Ireland, pre-12th century, and this is the most sophisticated one. Antrim is situated on a hill on this island, Drumlin Island, and the wonderful thing about it is that after one has the monastic experience, your eye travels over the lough to the mainland and the surrounding landscape, and one immediately starts to stimulates the imagination to what that landscape was like in the past. And this is a particularly interesting part of Ireland because in the late medieval period, after the 12th century, this was taken over by the Anglo-Normans, and then by the early 15th century, the Anglo-Norman colony was under pressure with the Gaelic resurgence. So what we have actually here within their field of vision is a mini Pale. We all know about the Great Pale round Dublin, but here actually existed for about a century a little Pale. Because if we look down here, we see Sketterick Castle, the remains of Sketterick Castle, and it was an outpost from Dublin. Where we stand became O'Neill land, purely Gaelic. Beyond there was still in the hands of the Old English colony. Sketterick Castle became so isolated as a frontier castle one time, it had to be provisioned actually from Dublin. So we're on a major boundary here and a clash of cultures, and eventually, of course, the Anglo-Norman English colony became more Irish than the Irish, as they say. 17th century, we'll get a new phase with the plantation, and this all became Hamilton lands, and we can see elements of that in the landscape where a total reorganisation, and we get our field systems evolving, we get our farms and our clacking, and it's all there to be read, and this is a lovely place to read it. And I'm looking across here at Wood Island. On the top of Wood Island there was a vast oyster midden. There was enough shells there for a local farmer in the 19th century to build a little lime kiln, and he used the oyster shells to make lime to spread on the fields. That shell midden would be prehistoric, dates back to about the 4th millennium, maybe about 6,000 years old. And that would be another attraction for the monk, these great oyster beds that formerly existed in that area there. Oysters, of course, were the fast food, the prehistoric period, medieval period. All you had to do was go down and it was like having a hamburger. And then there's continuity too, because again, if we look towards Sketterick again, we have our modern oyster farm down there, now using Pacific oysters. So the lough has still given sustenance to us.
I've worked on the ferry since October '69, so I've seen a few changes. People on, boats on, everything else. Obviously that's the new boat we have in service there now. She was built, I think it was 2000, so she's 10-year-old now. The other boats like myself, she's 41 years here now, so the boat is the Lough's the attraction. Because there's always something different, you know, the tide's in or out, or it's halfway, or it's choppy, or it's smooth. You can see some of the sunsets from down over Lecale there, you know yourself what the Lough looks like. Even going back and forward to Portaferry to Strangford, there's always something different. I mean, this morning there was a boat that went across my bows. He should have known better, but he doesn't seem to apply the rule of the road. He maybe doesn't understand it. When you're meeting a boat, there's a way to go for the two boats to pass safely. He didn't do that, so you have to look out for things like that. Because I know the rules, it doesn't mean the other person knows the rules. The same applies to your jet skis and what have you. They fly around us at times there. I don't mind them going behind us, but when they go in front of us, if they were to come off and you didn't see them in the water, we're a couple of 100 ton, doing possibly 12, 14 knots with the tide. And to get that stopped, it can be difficult to say the least. I was messing about in boats before I came to the ferry, and diving on it this 40 years as well. I'll be on the bottom as well as on the top of it, so it's all a variety of different types of bottom. You've sand, you've shingle, you've rocks, you've stone, you've kelp, you've mud. It's just another world down there. Well, I suppose there is a community to a degree. There's people go socialising in Portaferry, there's people socialise in Strangford. Portaferry children go to the Downpatrick schools, the Strangford people go to Portaferry. Business people, office workers, bankers, everyone travels. And then you have a connection with Ardglass and Portavogie fishing harbours, so the fish lorries and buyers and what have you travel with us as well. So, I mean, if you had to go from Ardglass to Portavogie, I don't know, you're talking possibly 60, I would imagine something like 60 miles, I would think. Now it's 50 miles, I say it's 50 miles from Strangford Square to Portaferry Square. The old people used to talk about the horse boat here, it came from Bankmore to Strangford. The Lough always was different, as I say, there was always something, every time you looked out of the window there was something different to look at. Their tidal turbine, first in the world, so that was a big mark up for Strangford Lough, the fact that they could have picked it literally anywhere in the world and saw fit to choose Strangford Lough. So I think that says it all. Number one in the world for the turbine, the first turbine, the tidal turbine in the world. So as I say, that says it.
What strikes you about living in Portaferry really is how the rhythm of our lives is affected by the tides and by the ferry service. It's incredible to think, but there's been a ferry here for 400 years and it's been running here ever since James I, back in 1612, assigned a piece of land from Strangford at Ferry Quarter and also a little bit in Portaferry to a man called Peter Tomilton. And he was charged with providing a ferry service for the transport of people and cattle and any other services that might be associated with the ferry. And it's just incredible to think that that tradition has continued down through the centuries. Today, of course, the ferry is more associated with cars, but it still does provide a whole range of other services. And that's one of the things that I suppose has really struck me the longer that I live here. The ferry provides a real link for education, for example. The children leave here in the morning and they head over to Strangford and they catch their bus to Downpatrick and Ballynahinch. The children from Strangford come back over here to go to school in Portaferry. And not a lot of people realise it, but the ferry's also involved in a sort of informal postal service, because you can drop a package on at one end and have it delivered right across the water into the safekeeping at the other side. And it's just a lovely, I suppose, difference to living in Portaferry that we have that here. And the ferry's even been involved as a rescue service. It has been known to lift people out of the water when they get in trouble. And of course the ferrymen have got a tremendous vantage point as they're passing over and back every half hour across the Narrows. The history of the ferry service is extraordinary. I mean, there was a steam ferry service here across the Narrows even before there was one in Belfast. And the Lady of the Lake was the ferry that was travelling at that time. And it was only in 1967, really, that it passed into public hands. Before that, there were many families associated with the ferry service, and those are the names that are still here: the Trainers, the Tumulties, the Quails. And again, that tradition of being involved with the ferry is really something that's unique to this area, I think.
I've been very lucky to have been sailing in Strangford Lough for over 50 years now. I started sailing when I lived on Mahee Island in the river class, which are beautiful 30-foot one designs. And they've been at White Rock since about 1921, so they're celebrating the 80th anniversary this year at Strangford Lough. But in recent years I've been a member of Strangford Sailing Club, and we sail Flying 15s here. And the club has been on Strangford Lough since about 1946 or 47, when they were in the village in Strangford. But we've now moved to this beautiful location in Castle Ward in Audley's Roads here, and we really love the location. As you can see, it's a beautiful morning, nice easterly breeze coming in, and we're just about to go to sail. Lord Bangor was a very lucky man. He was able to sit in his drawing room, and he had his river class boat, by the way, called Strull, which was moored off the boathouse, and he had his boatman called Ernest Swale, and he had the boat ready. And when Lord Bangor arrived, all he had to do was step aboard and go sailing.
No matter where you are out sailing, if it's around here in the Castleward Bay or up the loch, or no matter where you go, I think that's the main thing that makes it sort of quite unique. And the loch itself is unique as well, just in terms of even, you know, the tides, currents. From a sailing point of view, that adds just a little bit of extra sort of challenge to it. If you've been sailing for a while and you know the currents and you know about the tides, it's sort of an advantage, because then you've got that extra little bit of experience behind you, and it actually makes it, you know, a little bit more exciting. It shows you about respect for the loch from a very young age. Obviously, you know, the kids are learning about the dangers of water as well, but that you can still have fun.
I was born in Strangford and went to London and places, and when you come back and you look around here, especially if the tide's in and it's an evening and there's a full moon rising over those trees, it reminds you that there's nowhere like home, really. And you go up the loch to sail, and we've virtually the lower end of the loch to ourselves. And lots of people have come over here for championships from England, and they cannot understand why the loch isn't dotted with caravan sites all over the place. Anything worse, you know. So that's why I like Strangford. I live at Carryduff now. I've been living there 40 years, but I still visit Strangford a couple or 3 times a week. This was our playground, Castle Ward here on the Old Court. When we were children, we played real cowboys and Indians. Because we had all this to ourselves. About every 4th year they would hold the national championships, such as the championships of the British Isles are held in quite a few classes, such as wayfarers, flying 15s, and lots of other dinghy classes would hold their championships here. And I think it's because of the safety of the loch. Like if you do get blown away, you're only going to be blown a couple of miles either side onto the shore in any case.
It's just the surroundings. It changes every day. The colours, the colour of the water, the colour of the trees. The seasons are reflected in the loch. And when you go to sail, unlike some lochs where there are no islands, we have all these lovely islands and platties, of course, which can sometimes be a hindrance to the sailor. But it's just the surroundings, the tranquility of it. And it is relatively underused from a sailing point of view. I mean, I've sailed in the south of England, and it's like the motorway, but Strangford Lough is a beautiful place. Some people are put off coming into Strangford Lough when they look at the chart and see all the rocks and the platties and the strong tides, but treat it with a lot of respect. Most of the sailors are at one with the loch, and we'd hate to see it being damaged in any way. I would always say when visitors come, please don't tell anybody about it. I suppose it's very selfish, but my favourite time of the loch is the winter time, when there are not so many people around. And there you are, there's a heron just flying across here. And the amazing thing is that the wildlife are not frightened off by humans. They've got used to the humans being here. They're not frightened of us anymore.
Poor old Ballyhenry Island itself has had quite a mottled history, hasn't it? I mean, apart from its ancient, millions of years old bedrock, Silurian bedrocks, it was a breaker's yard for a while, wasn't it? They used to bring ashore wrecks here to recycle the metal.
Still a bit of debris on the south side of the island. There used to be an old wooden tug there when I first came here, and then one enthusiastic group of students I knew having a barbecue on the shore set it on fire. And of course, being made of wood, it didn't last too long. But there are other bits out there as well that I think you know more about than I do.
Well, there's certainly one. We always call it Lee's Wreck, because of course he was the guy who owned the breaker's yard, I think. But actually, she was the Empire Tana, and she was one of the Mulberry Harbour ships. And apart from that, was used for emergency shipping. The trouble was, built in an emergency wartime situation, she wasn't actually very good quality. And at the end of the war, she really wasn't worth hanging on to. Lee bought her up, tried to bring her here into Ballyhenry Island, and of course wanted to bring her in on a spring tide to get her as high up the beach as possible. But the tide started dropping before they got her there, and the wind caught her. She got stuck on a rock, and of course as the tide fell, the back of this old hulk broke. And if you look out there now, you can just see that sort of square, chunky looking piece of rusting metal. And I've dived around the bottom of it, and it's absolutely fabulous. It's like a garden full of sea anemones, sea urchins. Every now and then you get the odd conger eel in there. All sorts of marine life.
Well, I tend to be rather shore-bound myself, but I remember wading out on a very low tide once into the north side of the bay here, and there's actually the remains of a small World War I German submarine in there. At least that's what the locals tell me it was.
You've got sort of painting an image that somewhere there's a pair of German U-boat commanders' binoculars sitting there on the seabed just waiting for another sighting.
Well, I wouldn't blame them for hanging around this area.
No.
This reading is from All Souls Night, which is probably his best known play. It's regarded now as an Ulster classic, and it is very much about the loch and the tradition that the dead return to their homes on All Souls Night. And in this passage he's talking about the ghost of the boy who's been drowned in the loch has come back to the house and is talking about his death, having just had a quarrel with his mother, who has shouted at him and forced him out to sea, and he's afraid of the sea. He doesn't want to go, but nevertheless he has to go. And he says, "You could hear the temper in my voice, but not the terror. You could urge me launch the boat and see her dance away from the shore. You could see the oars dip as my tired arms tugged them through the water. You could see me round the point. Then you closed the door. You could see nothing then but the bright fire burning in the hearth. You couldn't hear the east wind as it tore up the loch and flung the sea into the boat. You didn't see me as the oars leapt to meet me in the rowlocks and the rotten gunnels, nor did you see her crack like withered twigs. You didn't see her fling me out into the sea like a curving pellock. My loud words of anger were in your ears, but you didn't hear the words that death forced up my throat. Save a life, save a life, save a life. You didn't see the wave that carried death into my dancing body. You didn't see my tired fingers claw the water and rake the wreck until the sand oozed over them as I lay at the bottom. Fresh as the memory. Well, it is how I see it, but I know it's not how anyone who knows it sees it, because as children, Francis and I spent a lot of time trying to persuade my father's brother to take us sailing on it or out rowing on it, but we'll just go up to the Walter Rock. And he would look at it, and it would look beautiful and calm, and he'd say, no, you couldn't go out today, it's not a good day. And his friend, the late Father Hughie Mullen, who was a great sailor, who also sailed with him, would say, no, you couldn't go out today. And Tommy Hutton, our next door neighbour in Portaferry, who was the pilot for Lord Londonderry at Mount Stewart, he would say, no, you couldn't go out today. And yet you'd look at it and there would hardly be a ripple on it. But they knew somehow that all was not well with it. We were never able to tell that. It always just looked beautiful and calm to us. But it's a very dangerous place, and it has its very own life and its very own undertow, I think. And my father wrote definitely about the darker side because he understood that. His neighbours had been drowned. They'd watched the father and brother drowned in front of the loch. Other people in Portaferry who he knew had been drowned in it. His great uncle had sailed before the mast, and he had a very great respect for it, and talked about seeing the ghosts of sailors on Rock and Goose, and hearing the cries of save a life of the drowned on Rock and Goose, near the bar. So yes, I suppose in his work, although there are moments when the loch is laughing and the gulls are shrieking and the seals are coughing, and All Souls Night at one point the seals are coughing. Nevertheless, the loch is a dark place.
I'm William Montgomery, and I have the luck to live in Grey Abbey, where my family have lived for rather more than 400 years. My predecessor, Hugh Montgomery, came to Newtonards in 1606. He had a younger brother called Sir James Montgomery, whose memorial as a child always fascinated me because it's in the abbey down below the house, and it says, "Sacred to the memory of Sir James Montgomery, by pirates shot and thereof dead." But as a child, it always seemed a very glamorous way to end your life. James was given the estate here by his brother, and the family have been here continuously, with the exception of the Cromwellian period, when the Montgomery of the day was put out of the estate by a Cromwellian colonel for about 10 years. This is the third house. The first we know nothing about, except the stone you and I are sitting on the lawn is meant to be all that remains of it. It was burnt down and destroyed in the Great Rebellion. A new house was built, which again we know nothing about, because it was destroyed in a much more traditional way by a workman leaving a blowpipe on, and it was burnt down very extensively in 1758. And so this house was then built a tiny bit back on the site and finished in 1760. I count myself incredibly lucky because in one direction I can look at Strangford Lough, and beyond it the Mourne Mountains, and you and I, standing on the lawn today, can see Slieve Donard covered in snow and looking a little bit like a Japanese painting. And if we walk round the house to the other side, we have a wonderful view of the Cistercian monastery. So one way history and the other way nature and beauty. So I'm a lucky man like that. When my brother and I were sort of about 8, the great heroes of our life were two men. One, Thomas McAvoy, who was the last professional wildfowler living on the loch. And he lived out on Mid-Island, and in the winter he would make his living by going out with his punt and punt gunning. And during the summer they farmed the islands, he and his wife and sons. Mrs. McAvoy had a flock of hens. To us it looked like an idyllic life, but we didn't have to wait for the tide to go down before they could walk across to the mainland. And we didn't realise the problems of not having electricity. Although I now go out and stay on the island quite often, and of course to us it's all a great thrill, but it's not an everyday occurrence. And then the other man who I looked upon in an almost godlike way was a man called Eddie Reagan, who lived in a cottage just below the stump of the windmill. His profession or work was a line walker for the electricity board, and he would go out every day with a pair of binoculars and walk the lines. And he was a wonderful amateur ornithologist, knew more about birds than almost anyone I've ever met. and also had a fantastic collection of flints because he had time to look at the ground too. And below his house he kept a little sailing boat, and then he kept a little sailing boat for my brother and me. For us in the summer to go down and spend the day with Eddie was just unbelievable because he knew everything that was happening on the loch. We used to go out and see the terns, and of course he took us fishing. And of course at my age, every day seems to have been sunny. And you know, the joy of waking up every morning and seeing the loch below you, and of course, as you know, it's different every day because of the tide. And during the winter, the sound of the geese, and particularly in February, March, when they're thinking about migrating, sometimes we get great flocks of whooper swans below the house, come out quite late at night sometimes to put the dogs out. And you can hear this wonderful sound, rather like halfway between bells chiming and a pack of hounds, coming up on a still night from the loch below. And of course then one morning they've gone, and hence the idea of the swan song, because they get louder before they migrate, and the night before they migrate there's this wonderful sound, and then the next day it's silence, so they've gone. I came to Grey Abbey aged 6 in 1946, in that my father was away during the war. The house was used as the headquarters of the Northern Ireland Electricity Board, so the vital war work of sending out electricity bills could go on. I mean, the village has changed enormously. I mean, it was a self-contained little community then. There was a tailor, a shoemaker, obviously a grocery shop, 2 public houses, 3 public houses then, and a hardware shop. And really going to Newton Ards was an event. Belfast was a sort of place that you went to maybe once a year, or you obviously went if you were travelling because you took the boat to England from Belfast. But a lot of people who lived on the estate then would have only been to Belfast 2 or 3 times in their life. Newton Ards was the big city, or the big town anyway, that you went to. It's very rare, this wonderful thing of being by the loch. It's different from being by the sea, because you look out across the sea and there's the horizon, if it's there, is a long way away, and on a good day maybe you can just see the Isle of Man, but the loch you can see the islands, and just the whole thing of the movement of the tide, the birds. Every day it's magic for me, and I was very touched. Our son got married not long ago. The wedding was in Scotland, and during his speech said one of the things that he was thrilled about was that his bride was already in love with County Down, and that he genuinely felt that the happiest moments of his life was being out on the loch, and it was just part of his life. And we're very lucky in that frequently I would go riding on the loch, and as long as you remember not to talk, the birds just think it's some sort of big cow or something, and they get up and move 20 yards or 30 yards. But it's the human voice that gives you away. As long as you move relatively slowly on a horse, it's amazing what you can see. So last spring, I was out on Chapel Island, and I knew that a vixen lived out there. She'd maybe just mistimed the tide coming in. It comes in both ways on that bit of sand. And I was on the horse on a bluff on Chapel Island, and I saw her and 4 little cubs coming from the mainland, and the tide had just covered about 50 yards, I should think. And I saw her saying, well, come on, we've got to do it, we've got to get home. And they were all swimming along with their brushes out behind them, and then coming out and shaking and trotting onto the land. You know, it's an extraordinary sight, you know.
Edward Hincks was born in 1792 and died in the 1860s, whose name is just unknown. And yet, with the opening of the Ulster Museum again, people are talking about Takabuti, the mummy. It was Edward Hincks who unrolled it, and he was the man who came to be the rector of Killaloe, and he was the last 40 years of his life there. Yet, when people had hieroglyphics to read, they were digging things up in the sands of Arabia, and they were looking at these hieroglyphics and saying, what does all this mean? And say, we'll send it to Edward Hincks in Killaloe. Now, when did you last send either a copy of a stone or a stone 6 feet high from the sands of Arabia in the 1860s to Killaloe? There was no fast post in those days. It's just amazing. And when he got them, the rectory was full of stuff. He knew how to read it. He could read the cuneiform writing. And you and I would say, hieroglyphics? Who's interested in hieroglyphics? But somebody in the world has to be interested in everything. And we've got to have an expert. And there was the expert closeted away in the rectory in Killaloe. There's a story told about Edward Hincks that in the middle of a sermon one morning, he just stopped and he said to his congregation, just hold on there a minute. He got out the pulpit, went away over to the rectory, obviously had something in his mind. He looked at something that had just arrived. He got some more information, wrote something down, and walked back from the rectory into the church and up into the pulpit and finished his sermon. Tell you, if that happened today, the congregation would be out and away home making their Sunday dinner. But there was the congregation sitting, waiting for the rector to come back and finish his sermon. So, I mean, his head was full of it. People in Killaloe would not have known the expert man they had as their rector. I mean, from time to time, he would have talked at the Institute in Downpatrick, or from time to time, people would be talking about Reverend Hincks was doing this or that. But the poor man was stuck in the rectory in Killaloe. He got no honours from his old alma mater, which was Trinity College. What an opportunity for Trinity to have the first ever professor of hieroglyphics there in Ireland. They never did anything. The church didn't elevate him, and nobody gave him his worth, his due. Even today's generation doesn't know the worth of Edward Hincks. He was definitely not a pushy man. He wouldn't have been to the fore in the social calendars of Downpatrick and Killaloe. Those in the town who would have known a little bit more probably did realise that he was doing some good work, not that they understood it. Very few people would have understood it, but at least they knew stuff was coming from Arabia for Reverend Hincks. Good gracious. This was the sands of Arabia. They were digging out, for example, like the old city of Nineveh that you read about in the Bible. Now, how he ever learnt that this said, I am the son of whoever, I have no idea, but he did, and he was the respected man here. And then it was put on the back of a camel. It was taken to the Red Sea. It was put on a boat to Alexandria, and then it was put on a boat to Malta, and then it was put on a boat to Spain, and then it was put on a boat to England. Then it was hustled round the country and brought over, and it landed at Killaloe Harbour, I'm told, on a little ship, dear knows how many months later, and some man with a horse and cart had to go down to the pier and bring it up to the rectory. This was a man who's fairly unassuming man. Can you imagine Edward Hincks? His face would just light up. More stuff to read. Every time I talk about it, my mind goes and my mind thinks what it must have been like. I still keep saying, you see these people in the middle of Arabia, the camels around them, the Bedouin tribesmen around them. Here they are digging up the city of Nineveh. And this stuff has to be read. What was going on in Nineveh? Oh, I have a great admiration for him because he was so unsung. Henry Blackwood is a name associated with County Down. It's associated with Ballyleedy House, which nowadays is called Clandyboy House. But this generation called the house Ballyleedy House, and Henry himself was the 11th child of his parents, born in 1770. Now, in 1770, most of the well-to-do and gentry children would have gone to the army or the priesthood, taken holy orders in the Church of Ireland. But Henry, who incidentally was born in Killilea Castle and spent lots of his time there, he's one of a big family, and rather than go to the church or to the army, the parents decided to send him to the navy, which was kind of unusual for the Blackwood family. But there he was, yes, Henry was brought into the parents, and Mummy and Daddy said to him, Henry, you're going to join the navy. And what age was Henry at the time? He was not long past his 10th birthday. And aged 10 and a quarter, he headed off from County Down to the south of England to join the fleet. Now, can you imagine what it was like to travel in 1780, 1781 across the sea to England, down in stagecoaches, stopping at all sorts of inns during his journey down? It must have been A, exhausting, and B, quite an experience. But he got to his appointed place, he joined his ship, and during his lifetime, he was on something like 20 different ships. He was fortunate. He may have only been 10, but he was able to be a midshipman rather than just an ordinary able seaman, which gave him a little bit of privilege, although I don't know what you would call privilege in some of those wooden ships, because the story, I mean, when I wrote my story of Henry Blackwood, a lot of it was concerned with what life was like to be a sailor in a ship where the cabin was hardly a cabin. You could hardly stand up in it. There were smells and food, and all of a sudden the captain would say, oh, here we're in a battle, and the next thing they'll be firing cannon shells, and they'll be loading cannon shells, and the next thing he'd turn around and he'd see his pal's head blown off with a cannonball from the enemy ship. It must have been horrendous. But as a midship, when he was able to take command, and he was able, even in his early teenage years, to show leadership potential. And I think he was a very likeable young man. So he moved up the ladder very well, and he really became a splendid sailor. I mean, obviously the best thing that we know, the biggest thing we know of Henry Blackwood is the time that he got to know Horatio Nelson, Lord Nelson. Nelson would have heard of Blackwood because he was moving up the ladder, as I say. He was becoming a very efficient commander of ships. And then he gets involved in the Battle of Trafalgar. Well, first of all, it's Blackwood who goes to reconnoitre to find out where the enemy is, which was a very dangerous job in those days. But he went, he found the information, he joined Horatio Nelson and participated in the Battle of Trafalgar, which, you know, was very bittersweet, as we know. It was a victory. But in the middle of it all, Horatio Nelson was killed. Now, why was Horatio Nelson killed? Well, it was just like this. He called from his HMS Victory to all the other captains, and, you know, that was a series of flags and pennants, and wait till you hear this story. Like, Blackwood and the other captains were summoned from their ships to Victory, to HMS Victory. They had to get dressed up in their full gear. They had to climb down the ladder of the ship, get into a little boat, be rowed across by their men. This is just before the raging of the battle, just before it. And all the men, by the way, weren't just in their old duds. They all had to be dressed up in their proper gear to row their captain over to Victory. And then there'd be big squelches of water coming over. Poor Henry would get up to the boat and he'd be dripping from head to toe. He wasn't allowed to go into Nelson until he was dried off. So eventually they got down sitting with Nelson to say, look, don't you be dressing up in your colourful gear because the first French sniper and sharpshooter will shoot you dead. Oh, he ignored that, and the first thing that happened, guess what? A French sharpshooter shot him dead. And Blackwood, this is the important thing, the only Irish captain that Nelson had at Trafalgar was one of those who witnessed the signing of the will before Nelson died. The man was well thought of by Nelson, and many people thought he would go far. He did go far. He commanded various ships. A couple of years later, he had a horrendous experience on HMS Ajax, which was in the Eastern Mediterranean in 1807, 2 years after Trafalgar. A baker in the bakehouse on his boat was drunk, set the place on fire. The ship went on fire. The ship sank and lost 250 sailors. And Blackwood himself was bobbing about in the water for an hour before somebody saved his life. So eventually, after commanding all these boats, he had several wives. I don't mean obviously all at the one time. Sadly, his first two wives died quite soon. He had 4 or 5 children, and some of his sons went into the Navy too. He was a very likeable and good father. But at the end of his life, it was a very sad ending. He was only just over 60, 61, I think, when his son got typhus fever. So Henry said, we'll come across to Ballyleedy House, we'll stay there, we'll get recuperated. And they came over to Ballyleedy and started to recuperate. The son got better, but passed the disease to the father, and within a few days Henry Blackwood had died. And they brought him from Ballyleedy to the parish church in Killilea, where he was buried. And today we can still see all these wonderful memorials on the walls of the parish church of who Henry Blackwood was and other members of his family.
I was brought up in London. I was familiar with Sloane Square. I was familiar with the British Museum. I was familiar with the Natural History Museum. When I bought the house, it was advertised with an attachment to Hans Sloane. The estate agent was wrong about that. There's no attachment between my house and Hans Sloane. But I wondered who was this Hans Sloane with a connection to Killilea. And to my amazement, I found he was born in Killilea in 1660. His father died. He had 2 surviving brothers, but his mother remarried and moved away from the immediate vicinity, leaving him to be brought up by friends and family. He was educated in the castle library and a local school. He then became ill, and through the illness he read a lot. He looked at the loch for his inspiration for wildlife, particularly the plants he was particularly interested in, but he was also interested in animal life. He left to go to London at the age of 19, studied in London, then went to Paris, studied in Paris. Couldn't take his degree in Paris, however, because he was the wrong religion, but he went to the University of Orange and graduated there as a medical doctor and a natural scientist. He returned to London and secured a position as physician to the new governor of Jamaica. And off he went to Jamaica, and his passion was collecting. He collected plants, collected parts of animals, and on his return he produced 2 volumes, one of the first great science travel logs that have been produced in science. He continued his work as a doctor. He was physician to royalty, but he also tended the poor. One thing that he is famous for is that he brought back to Britain the idea of sweetening chocolate. Chocolate was known. He didn't invent chocolate, and it was a rather bitter drink. He didn't like it as a bitter drink, so he thought of adding sugar and milk, and he brought that back and he used that as a medicine. But it became popular, and he sold the recipe on to various people, which then went on to the Cadbury brothers. So the Cadburys eventually used Hans Sloane chocolate, and they used that name in their advertising. He became quite wealthy. He invested well. He was interested in using plants as pharmaceutical agents, and some of those were very successful. And he collected all his life. He had a house in Bloomsbury in the centre of London, and he filled it completely with his collection. He had to buy the house next door to expand the collection, and he filled that house. And he was looking for somewhere larger, and he found a very large manor house on some marshy land in a place called Chelsea. And so he bought the house and the land and filled the house and continued to invite a vast number of people to his house, to his museum. On Sloane's death, that collection passed to the nation. He didn't leave it to the nation quite. He offered it to be sold to the nation for the princely sum of £50,000 to help provide for his daughters. But his daughters did quite well because they had Chelsea as well, the house and Chelsea. However, the nation bought the collection, and they created a lottery to get some funding to build the British Museum. And the reason why the British Museum was built was specifically to house Hans Sloane's collection. Subsequently, the items of natural history were split off from that museum and put into the Natural History Museum, and his books went to the British Library when that was created. So Sloane has been a fundamental creator, if you like, of some of the great academic institutions of the United Kingdom. And it was through his early efforts that gave insights into later scientists such as Darwin as to how everything fitted together and how evolution worked. In his lifetime, scientists throughout Europe came to see him and see his collection. He was the King's physician. He was president of the Royal Society, took over from Sir Isaac Newton. He was also president of the Royal College of Physicians, and no person's ever held those two posts in their lifetime. So he was a huge figure.
Well, the first Hamilton was born in Scotland and came across in 1604, but the method by which he managed to obtain Killelea is worth a story. He was a son of the Vicar of Dunlop. He was well connected in the court in Edinburgh to James VI of Scotland, and he became really the right-hand man of James VI in Ireland. And in fact, James VI sent him to Dublin to look after his interests in Ireland. James VI, of course, knew that he was in line to the throne of England, and he became James I of England ultimately. But he had to have reports coming back from Ireland as to what was happening here. So he sent James Hamilton really as a spy to Dublin. And while he was reporting back to James VI in Scotland, he discovered a plot by a man called Hugh Montgomery to free Con O'Neill from Carrickfergus Castle. Con O'Neill was a landowner of this part of County Down. Anyway, he reported back to the king that really the plot by Hugh Montgomery to free Con O'Neill in return for half his lands was really too much. For several reasons. One, it left Con O'Neill with too much land, and also to give half the property to Hugh Montgomery was also dangerous. So he persuaded the king to ultimately split it three ways, and he actually gave James Hamilton a third. But within 5 or 6 years of coming to County Down, James Hamilton had managed to swipe, steal, plunder, rob, buy, whatever you want to call it, the remaining third from Con O'Neill. And actually then the two families ran a skirmish for about 30 years as they fought over who had influences there. Montgomery got the Ards Peninsula effectively, and Hamilton got the inside sweep from Bangor to Downpatrick, basically. By the time he died, he was one of the biggest landowners in Ireland. And his son did extremely well and continued the success of the family, and was ultimately raised an army for Charles I and became the Earl of Clanbrassil as a result. Unfortunately, his son, the second Earl, Henry, was weak in the head, and he was eventually poisoned by his wife after his wife persuaded him to change the Hamilton will. There were no heirs. Henry had no heirs. He was writing to his mother, the first Countess, and he said, I'm going to change the will so the Hamiltons will no longer inherit. It will actually go to my wife's family. And the first Countess wrote to her son and said, the day you sign that will will be the day you're signing your death warrant. And indeed, it took about 40 days after signing the will before he was found dead in the castle, having been poisoned by his wife. And the 4 younger brothers of the original Hamilton then sued her in court, and it went into court for about 70 years, such that all the participants, the protagonists within the argument, had all died by the time the judge had decided. And the way the judge decided was quite remarkable, because in that time, paper, of course, was a precious commodity. And Alice Moore had burnt the original Hamilton will, which had the entail in it. But she didn't realise that the wrapper of the original will was itself an early draft of that will. And the wrapper was found 60 years after the event in the strong room in the castle here. So the judges used that as the basis for their decision. And they agreed that the Hamilton properties should all go to the 5 younger, in fact there were 5 younger brothers. Now, the Killelea property was inherited by Gawn and by Anne. They were first cousins, and the judges decided that the Killelea property should be split between the two of them. The boy got the castle, the girl got the gatehouse, or what was then a big Georgian house. And the girl got the left-hand side of the high street, the boy got the right-hand side of the high street. Now, she married a Blackwood, and they went on to become the Duffrins. So that was the first connection with the Hamilton family, between the Hamiltons and the Duffrins. The boy continued living in the castle. A series of Gawn and Archibalds were born. There were about 6 or 7 generations, flipping alternatively between Gawn and Archibald. It's just a family habit. But the name Rowan came into the family really through Gawn Hamilton, who lived between 1729 and 1805. He went to London to find a bride, and he married a Jane Rowan, who was an only child. whose parents were rich bankers. Jane Rowan was clearly used to city life. They got married in London, they came to Killaloe, she spent 3 weeks here before she turned around and went back to London, never to step foot in Killaloe again, or in Ireland at all. Her father was very wealthy, and she had a number of children, the eldest of which was Archibald. Now, Archie was an extraordinary man. As a rich young man in the 1700s, he did do his European tour, and he spent a lot of time in France, where he became a friend, a favourite of Marie Antoinette's. While in France, though, he befriended Benjamin Franklin, who was over from America, trying to raise an army to fight the British. And this is where I think he first developed a strong liberal tendency. Really what I'm describing is a man who did exactly what he wanted. He was well off. He was also clearly quite intelligent too in the way that he looked at things. And ultimately, when he came to Killaloe, he, not surprisingly, got involved in Irish politics, but not on the side that you might expect. He was a great campaigner for Catholic emancipation. During that time, he also became friends with Wolfe Tone. In fact, Wolfe Tone appointed him acting chairman of the United Irishmen when it was formed. And he continued to dally with quite radical politics of the time. He eventually got arrested by the British authorities for seditious libel, and he was held captive in Newgate Prison in Dublin. But while in prison, he got involved with a reverend who was his go-between between the Irish rebels and the French. And he ultimately signed a letter, he was one of the signatories of the letter asking the French to invade. And this was a step too far for the British authorities. This was an act too great. And when the news broke that the British authorities knew about this plot, Hamilton Rowan decided to flee. But ultimately his wife, back in Killaloe, continued to campaign for him, and in the late 1700s he was allowed to return to Europe, and then from Europe he ultimately was pardoned and he came to live at Killaloe, where he got his wealth back and he lived very happily. However, the fact that he was technically a traitor to the crown was difficult for his son, Gawn. Gawn became a commodore in Nelson's navy, and Gawn had a problem because his name was being shortened in the navy to Captain Rowan, when in fact he was a Hamilton. He also wanted to distance himself from his father, I think, who of course was guilty of treason. So Gawn flipped the name from Hamilton Rowan round to Rowan Hamilton. So it was actually only Hamilton Rowan for one generation. And from there we go about 5 generations to me. I was born and brought up here, so I've known of no other home, and Killaloe is very much, where my heart is.
Killeef, in case you're wondering what it means the Church of the Wattles. There was archaeology and settlement here hundreds of years before the Tower House was actually built. The name kind of gives away what it is. Tower House, it's a tall building, it forms a tower. It would have been reasonably defensive if you wanted to stop anybody getting in. And unlike houses today, it was arranged with rooms one on top of one another, and really just one main room on each floor, and fantastic views from the roof. Tower houses are found really throughout Ireland, but particularly in this area of Lecale. We've got tower houses like this one at Killeef, which are called gatehouse tower houses, and their names derive because they've got 2 little turrets projecting from the front of the tower, and it was believed in the past that these were copied from bigger castles and the gatehouses that were at them, so they're very distinctive to this area of Lecale. And Killeef is an unusual tower house because we've got a bit of tradition as to when it was built. We've got a date for when it was built, and it's also got a bit of scandal associated with it, as you'll hear. So altogether we can build up a picture of Killeef more than some other tower houses. And the reason we've got the scandal and the date for Killeef is Killeef seems to have been owned by the Bishop of Down, a chap called John Seeley. He became the Bishop of Down in 1413. And in the 1430s he was accused of living in his castle at Killeef with Lettice Thomas. And he's more accused not that he's living with a woman, but that she was a married woman that he was living with at the time. He was threatened with excommunication and being removed from his office, but he managed to hold on for about another 7 years, and in 1441 he was eventually removed because he hadn't repented of his sins, so to speak. In 1601, when O'Neill is battling with the crown, there was a chap called Nicholas Fitzsimons was stationed here with 10 warders to guard the area. The loch wouldn't really have looked very different. We've got a little bay in front of the castle, and I think that probably was important in the medieval period. We know that there was a church site just almost beside the castle, really from the 10th century at least. But I think the bay in front of where the church would have been, we also know that it was a leper hospital at Killeef.
So there would have been a bit of a medieval settlement here, or maybe a little village associated with the church. Okay, we'll go inside, and as always with the tower houses, you've got your door in the side of one of these gatehouse turrets. That's typical of them. And if we look straight up above us, we can see an arch through which anyone living in the house could have dropped anything they wanted down, and anyone they didn't want to get in. So it's a variation on ringing the doorbell. You come to the door here. If he doesn't want you in, you duck or run. Okay, we've come in through the front door of the tower house now, and the first room we come into here, it's very typical of tower houses. It's got a vaulted stone roof on it, and as you can hear from the echoes in here, it was a room down below, and this room would have been used for storage, for storing your food, presumably for your wine. It's lit by two quite small windows, so it's quite dark, but it would have been quite a good place for storing foodstuffs. It would have kept the temperature reasonably constant. So you can imagine servants or whatever coming into this room and bringing the food to the rooms up above. In Ireland, they represent a wealthy class. They're found in areas that were settled by the Normans and found in areas that were native Gaelic, and they just reflect whoever got a bit of power in that area and a bit of money, and it's a very obvious way of showing they've got it, and also to protect themselves at the same time. There's a fantastic reference to tower houses actually from 1547 from the Ormond deeds, which I came across. It says the number of rooms there were to be 3 what they call lofts or floors, and that there's to be both a mason and a carpenter appointed to build it. So you can imagine that the sheer number of these throughout Ireland, there was a whole industry building them, and the fact so many of them have survived to today shows how well they were built. We come in now to the first floor above the vault, which is a much more appealing room if you were going to be living in the castle. It's got a fireplace in the corner, which was actually inserted after the castle was built. And it's got a nice window seat looking out over the lough. And also on the other side, across from the stairs, we come into the second turret. And this is the equivalent in the tower house of your ensuite. The turret has actually latrine blocks on each floor to serve the room that you're in, and its own little wall cupboard as well for keeping your equivalent of your toilet roll holder or whatever there, and your toilet, which all of the toilets in the block empty down into a pit, which could have been emptied on the ground floor. So if you were the unlucky servant that week, that was your job to clean out the latrine pit. You can imagine with a wee bit of heat from the fireplace that it would have been quite a desirable place to live. And we've some interesting references to tower houses from medieval travellers who came to Ireland, and there's one of them which describes a very hospitable visit to a tower house where he says when you arrived at the door, the lady of the house would meet you, and you had to take a sample each of the drinks that they had in the castle. We'd had a feast on the floor with various servants and so on, then you went to bed. He does say that you were very lucky if you had a bed on your own, and that often there'd be a number of people in the bed. And the next morning before you left, it was also traditional that you repeated what happened when you arrived, that you had a drink for the road from the lady of the house, and you sampled each of the drinks they had in the house as well. We're up now on the second floor of the tower. This is a wee bit more upmarket even than the floor below. We've got window seats, not just one overlooking the lough, but one on the opposite side looking inland. And it's also got an original fireplace from the castle, and that's one of the more interesting features in the castle, because the lintel of the fireplace is actually part of a medieval coffin, a 13th century medieval coffin. So it shows not only reusing of materials in those days, but also a degree of lack of respect almost for a degree of, that's a 13th century gift, so it might have been 150 years old when the castle was built, and especially when we consider that it's a castle of the bishop. It's a bit unexpected to find that he reused a grave, presumably from the nearby church, for his fireplace. Okay, we've come up yet another floor, and we're now up on the third floor of the castle, and I think originally this room might have been where the bishop and lettuce may have lived. This might actually have been almost like their bedroom or their private room, but still quite a comfortable big room, and if it was a bedroom, I mean bigger than your average bedroom in a house now. The details especially are showing people the importance and the wealth of the owner. It's a bit like today's garden walls and ornate entrances and so on. They kind of reflect the house you're going to come to.